Hey, how's it going everyone? Today I have a versus battle that has been constantly requested by both my viewers and channel members, and I for one can't call myself a man of the people if I don't give them what they want. Before we begin, I'd like to plug my Discord server, which you can join by becoming a channel member or by supporting my Ko-Fi. If you want to talk to people about how powerful your favorite verses are, then you may want to consider joining. We promote healthy scaling and discourse. Now with that being said, let's talk about Crocodile versus Gaara, the Sandy Boys. This is a fight that at first glance you might think is simple, but like Gojo versus the 5 Kage, it boils down to how one thinks a specific interaction will go down. Unlike many of my other videos, I'll be splitting up this encounter into two separate parts: Alabasta Crocodile versus pre-time skip Gaara, and Marineford Crocodile versus War Arc Gaara. I believe that the result of the fight changes depending on what versions of both of these characters you're using, and since I've never scaled Part 1 Naruto, it gave me the perfect opportunity to read through the earlier portion of the series. As always, there won't be any verse equalization, so with all that out of the way, let's begin. Before we even start with any scaling, I want to set up some parameters for the fight. For the sake of keeping the video as short and sweet as possible, we're going to say that Gaara's personal sand and Crocodile's body are entirely uncontrollable by the opposite party. I'm not gonna try and debate anyone on whether or not Gaara can manipulate Crocodile or Crocodile can manipulate Gaara's personal sand. Crocodile is living sand, and Gaara's sand has his mother's spirit possessing it, so I'd rather not even consider the potential headache of trying to figure out who would control who through some mental gymnastics and headcanon. After all, neither series holds a precedent for how this interaction can go down. The location shouldn't matter, though I imagine most people would assume they're battling in a desert. I won't really be factoring the environment for the fight, but if you ask me, Gaara definitely benefits more from fighting in a desert than Croco Boy, and I'll explain why I think this is the case in better detail later. Also, I won't be going into detail about Gaara's AP because it genuinely doesn't matter. The simple truth is he can't hurt Crocodile. If you look at Gaara's nature transformations, he doesn't have water style, so there's no way for him to deal damage to Crocodile. Unless you put these two in an environment that has nearby accessible water, I don't think Gaara will ever find a way to damage Croc, unless you think he can somehow figure out Croc's weakness and or force himself to bleed enough that he can actually make contact. I'm sure some of you are gonna say chakra is made up of half spiritual / mental energy, so it can probably damage Crocodile via his soul. To that I say, no, that is not happening, and unless you can prove every jutsu Gaara has also damages the soul on contact, I'm not even going to entertain this as a possibility. Anyway, with all that being said, let's move on with the scaling. Trying to figure out Part 1 Gaara's speed is interesting because there are quite a few statements by the time of the tuning exams that imply the genin are anywhere around the transonic to hypersonic speed tiers. While combating the sound shinobi Dozu and Saku, Rock Lee could blitz Dosu by activating the first gate of opening, which allows the body to use 100% of its muscular energy, whereas usually the body can only use 20%. This would obviously imply, at the very least, a 5 times amp, as he was about to pile drive Dozu into the ground with the primary lotus. Zaku performed multiple hand signs and used sound waves as he was coming down to blast air into the ground, which cushioned the impact. If you think that the primary lotus is as fast as Lee while he's moving on the ground, then that would make the attack either relative or slower than the speed of sound, since Dozu later says their attacks are supersonic, which could be anywhere between Mach 1.1 to Mach 5. I personally think Lee is faster than the falling speed of the primary lotus, so we can say that with his weights on, he's at least Mach 1. I think this is a decent baseline to go with because Sasuke with the curse mark was capable of blitzing Zaku entirely on 2 separate occasions, one of which Zaku used another supersonic attack to try and hit him. Now by the time Lee fights Gaara, none of his attacks can land until he removes his weights. I can't tell you how much faster Lee moves without his weights, but in my opinion he seems to move about as fast as when he's performing the primary lotus, since he always disappears right before the starting kick, which could mean removing his weights makes him 5 times faster, or Mach 5, which is supersonic. The thing is, he doesn't seem to be any faster when he unlocks the first gate and hits Gaara. Either way, I'll give him the fairest interpretation possible, which should be at the very least a speed of Mach 25 or hypersonic, which seems to be fast enough to easily bypass the sand shield at this point in the story. By the time the Chunin exams reach their climax and Sasuke fights Gaara, he reveals that he was capable of replicating Lee's speed within a month, although Guy did say he's almost as fast as Lee's average speed, which means we can say Sasuke is also in that supersonic tier of about Mach 1.1 to Mach 5. Gaara's sand is consistently outmatched by these speeds. However, the reason why I'm going into this earlier scaling is to get a baseline for how fast one would need to be in order to outpace it, especially since Gaara has a habit of not really moving, so his own speed is technically irrelevant. I could also talk about Sasuke's Chidori or Gaara's Tailed Beast Cloak transformation, but Gaara's AP doesn't matter, and the version that's fighting Crocodile would be the one that fought Kimimaru, so I don't think Gaara would necessarily resort to using Shikaku's power, although again, I will talk about this later. One thing I do want to talk about in relation to his Tailed Beast Cloak is that if I give Gaara the fairest interpretation possible for the cloak, it's possibly a 10 times amp. There isn't any canon multiplier for this transformation, but if it's the equivalent of Naruto's one-tailed cloak, then one could argue it's at the very least a 10 times amp, like the Cursed Mark version 2 transformations. Under the assumption that the sand is at the very least as fast as Gaara, and it's on the lower end of supersonic, this would make Gaara's one-tailed form anywhere between Mach 11 to Mach 50, or hypersonic to high hypersonic. Naruto does fight this version of Gaara, but besides an off-guard kick, Gaara can consistently keep up with most of Naruto's assaults until he gets tagged with an explosive kunai, which damages him to the point Naruto can jump him with his multi-shadow clone jutsu. There also isn't a lot to go off of for how much faster Naruto could have potentially gotten in the following arc. Most of his training is in regards to mastering the Rasengan. When he fights Sasuke, who's fresh out of the hospital, they seem to be relative in speed, and the pair still gets blitzed by Kakashi, who is at the very least massively hypersonic due to his lightning cutting feat when he was younger. Also, no, Sasuke is not lightning speed because he performed Chidori. There is no way to bridge his speed to a 15 to 16-year-old Kakashi who was already a Jonin and an Anbu for several years. By the time of the Sasuke retrieval arc, the Sound 4 fought 2 Jonin and were forced to use their version 2 Cursed Marks in order to beat them. The Jonin were coming back from a mission, so they were out of chakra, but either way, those 2 Jonin have no feats, so it doesn't matter. It's difficult to determine just how fast these characters should be by this point in the story due to a lack of quantifiable statements and feats, but by the time the Sand Trio join the fight, Temari fights Tayuya, who uses sound-based genjutsu. Under the assumption that Tayuya's sound attacks scale up in speed due to the version 2 Cursed Mark, and under the assumption her attacks were at least as fast as Dozu and Zaku's supersonic sound waves, this would make her genjutsu about Mach 50 at the higher interpretations, and Temari could react to and blow away this sound with her fan. Assuming that Gaara also got stronger since we last saw him, his sand should be within this tier of speed since he could fight CM2 Kimimaru. Now, this is a higher interpretation, and Gaara does mention that Lee isn't as fast or as sharp as when they last fought, which would contradict this since Lee has been in the hospital for about 2 months. Kimimaru doesn't ever blitz the sand, and when he's using CM2, he mostly overpowers it, so depending on how one chooses to interpret the growth of these characters within the 2 months since the preliminary fights of the Chunin exams, they could be anywhere between Mach 5 to Mach 50, but I'll give them Mach 50 for the sake of fairness. Moving on to Alabasta Crocodile, I'm going to have to take some liberties with his speed because there is virtually nothing that can be used to quantify how fast he is as far as Alabasta goes. Considering the fact that the Straw Hats get stronger after every island they visit, we can make a couple of assumptions. As far as the East Blue Saga, Luffy can react to and hit Kuro, who is faster than the eye can see. At least going by this speed scale from Versus Battle Wiki, that would make him anywhere around subsonic. And SBS states that Kuro's Shakushi is as fast as CP9's Soru. There's 2 ways of looking at this. Either you think Oda is referring to the technique's amp in speed, or you think he's referring to the characters themselves. If you go by the first interpretation, then Shakushi is about a 10 times amp like Soru, since Luffy uses Soru when he's using second gear, which is a 10 times amp, and he also states that CP9 agents kick off the ground 10 times in an instant to pull off this technique. The second interpretation would mean Kuro is beyond massively hypersonic to relativistic, since one can make an argument that One Piece lightspeed meta starts to become apparent around Enies Lobby, but possibly as early as Skypiea, although I'm going to go with the former interpretation. Under the interpretation that Kuro's pussyfoot maneuver is between Mach 0.1 to Mach 0.9, since Luffy could react to and grab him while he was using Shakushi, he should be anywhere around Mach 1 to Mach 9, or Sonic to low-end hypersonic. This would also be consistent with a later feat in the same arc, where Luffy shattered Don Krieg's spear after punching it 5 times mid-explosion. Explosions can be anywhere between 1500 to 3000 meters per second, so this feat would be anywhere between high-end supersonic to hypersonic, or Mach 5 to Mach 10, and if you want to go with a highball interpretation, then Luffy landed 5 punches as the explosions happened, so his combat speed could be Mach 25 to Mach 50. But we'll stick with the lower interpretation. In Whiskey Peaks, Zoro is capable of perception blitzing an entire town full of assassins as they stare at him and could get between them without anyone noticing. He could blitz their attempt at shooting him while being surrounded, and after having his arm tied with a steel rope, could yoink a grown man to take incoming bullets for him as they were already fired. During the Drum Kingdom arc, Dalton, who had eaten the Bison Zoan Devil Fruit, could move so fast he created after images of himself and moved fast enough that bullets couldn't hit him. The guns that most One Piece characters use are inspired by flintlock pistols and are modified so they can fire more than one bullet at a time. These pistols usually fire projectiles at 305 to 610 meters per second, or transonic to supersonic speed, so these feats would be consistent with the Mach 5 to Mach 10 ballpark I mentioned earlier, since they would be faster than these bullets and Dalton is weaker than Luffy. Speaking of Luffy, he can also stretch his arms so fast and so far at this point that they go beyond a 1500 foot tall mountain they're currently fighting on and reaching a distance of about 3 towns before Wapol can finish a sentence. Which means at this point in the story, Luffy's combat speed is so fast he can stretch his arms a distance of over 4.5 kilometers and then some to hit his opponents before I even finish this sentence. By the time he fights Croco Boy in Alabasta, Crocodile can dodge Luffy's punches, and while Luffy can do the same, Crocodile also doesn't seem to be taking this fight seriously. They fight a total of 3 times, and in every single encounter Luffy does a bit better, with the third fight being his best performance since he can now deal with everything Crocodile hits him with. But how fast is Crocodile? Like I said, there's nothing I can use to possibly quantify how much faster he got if I go by Alabasta alone, but if you use a bit of information from later on in the series, it might be quantifiable. In Enies Lobby, CP9 uses a special technique to determine their Doriki. Doriki measures the physical ability of a combatant, and it doesn't account for special powers like Devil Fruits. The reason why I bring this up is because Luffy fought Blueno and stated himself that he couldn't beat him like this. He needed to use second gear in order to make the fight one-sided. Blueno had a Doriki of 820 and Rob Lucci had 4000. We know it's a linear increase because he said his Doriki is 5 times greater than Fukuro, who had a Doriki of 800. This means Luffy's base became 4.9 times stronger after a single fight, since he later fights Lucci in base and performs relatively well. This is also consistent with the fact that he previously couldn't fight Blueno when they first met and completely matched him after a couple of hours with no training in between. Under the assumption that Luffy didn't get any stronger or faster across all of East Blue and he only had 2 major fights, those being Arlong and Wapol, Luffy on a lowball should have gotten 16 times stronger before his first fight with Crocodile. Since Doriki accounts for physical ability and not just strength, this would also mean he got about 16 times faster. This would also be consistent with Zoro's statement that they get stronger after every island. This means on a lowball interpretation of Mach 5 to Mach 10, Luffy, by the time he first fights Crocodile, would be anywhere between Mach 80 to Mach 160, or high-end high hypersonic to massively hypersonic. This also wouldn't be an outlandish claim since they would fight Enel, who is literal lightning 1 arc later. Now, Under this speed scaling, Crocodile should be faster than Gaara by a lot. I'm not really going to go into Crocodile's AP because he only really has one big feat, and that is cleanly slicing through a portion of Alubarna Castle. Gaara's sand is tougher than a wall of tempered steel that's 5mm thick while hardened, but it could also be blown straight through by Sasuke's Chidori, which can create large holes in stone, it can destroy multiple walls of an inn, and it can easily pierce through a water tank. Whether or not Crocodile can slice his way through Gaara's sand is kind of irrelevant, because if he gets his hand on Gaara, the fight ends. Crocodile's Devil Fruit has the ability to absorb the moisture of whatever it is he is touching, which includes the very ground he stands on. Luffy, who had drunk enough water to bloat his entire body, was sucked dry in an instant. The only reason he survived is because the water he shot up into the air just so happened to fall on him. Against an opponent like Crocodile, who can win by simply making physical contact once, I can't really see him winning. I did have a conversation with my chat about the potential appearance of Shukaku, especially since Gaara doesn't have any sealing jutsu at this point. All in all, you'd have to give Gaara every benefit of doubt and say that he can achieve full host transformation before Crocodile touches him, and even then, Shukaku would have to eventually resort to sealing jutsu once he realizes he can't hurt Croco Boy. He would also have to reach this conclusion before Crocodile reaches Gaara and kills him. Now, moving on to War Arc Gaara versus Marineford Crocodile, I'm just going to give you the quick and easy speed scaling for Gaara. I'll also be giving him every single benefit of doubt, and I'll offer the highest interpretation that I'm personally comfortable with. War Arc Gaara, at least in terms of his sand, should be light speed. Around the time of the 5 Kage Summit, Sasuke Uchiha invades this monumental gathering in order to kill Danzo. The specific feat that at least adheres to the idea that Gaara's sand is possibly light speed is the moment where he fires sand projectiles at Sasuke alongside Tamari, Kankuro, and Daru. The most important attack here is Darui's Laser Circus Jutsu, which according to the data books fires rays of light. Under the assumption that all of Gaara's sand can move at light speed, and not just this one jutsu, we can at the very least say that by the time of the War Arc, his sand is capable of protecting him at the speed of light. I can't give him anything faster just because I have no way of quantifying his speed to be anything higher than this. Now, unlike the previous fight, Gaara actually does have a good way of defeating Crocodile, that being the Grand Sand Mausoleum. I'll go into the sealing jutsu in a bit, but for now, it is genuinely the only method by which he can deal with Crocodile. One Piece as a series starts to, at the very least, imply a light speed meta by the time we fight Enel in Skypiea. Whether or not the characters are light speed in every regard is up for debate. However, there are two separate statements, one by Nami and the other by Oda himself in an SBS, that introduce the idea of light speed. Right after Enel, we fight Foxy, who I've already talked about in this channel before, can generate beams of light and has slowpoke photons that slow down everything they touch. Depending on how one chooses to interpret the information that is being presented within the context of the story, there are at the very least 4 points in the story where one can argue that the Straw Hats, or at least Luffy, are definitively lightspeed. Sabaody Archipelago is the farthest point down the timeline where one can argue that Luffy and his crew start to reach lightspeed movement speed without straight up being disingenuous. The Pacifista can shoot beams of light, and we can see Luffy visibly dodging beams of light without even having Haki yet. I'm going to use this as a baseline because 2 arcs later he runs into Crocodile, who has been rotting in Impel Down for a while now. I have no real explanation as to how Crocodile got stronger while in prison other than Oda wanted this to be the case. He's clearly portrayed to be at least relative to Luffy during the escape, and I'm not going to account for Luffy getting stronger between Amazon Lily and Impel Down yet. When the escapees reach Marineford, Crocodile immediately goes for Whitebeard's head. Luffy intercepts and stops him while using second gear, which is a 10 times amp. The anime shows that Crocodile can dodge an attack from second gear Luffy, while the manga shows Luffy blocked his attack. In both instances, one could argue that Crocodile is fast enough at this point that Luffy needs second gear in order to fight him. Although I would argue that Croc at the very least had a head start. This is where you either think Crocodile is at the very least light speed or 10 times faster than light. Once again, I'm not accounting for Luffy getting stronger between arcs. I think now is a good time for me to talk about the specific interaction of Crocodile's Logia intangibility and the Grand Sand Mausoleum. I have no idea how this interaction is supposed to go down. I am not Kishimoto and I am not Oda. There is no precedent within the context of either series for how this interaction can go down, since Gaara has never fought an opponent who is literally natural walking sand as far as I'm aware. If you think Gaara can capture Crocodile within a Grand Sand Mausoleum and Crocodile can't phase out, then Gaara wins. If you think that Crocodile can somehow move his individual grains of sand through a giant pyramid made of compact sand, then Crocodile wins. I also want to make it clear that I can't tell you whether or not Crocodile would have the proper attack potency to bust out of the Grand Sand Mausoleum like Madara did, because his best quantifiable feat is slashing part of a castle. If I have to give you my honest opinion, Gaara should win this interaction. Now I'm going to try something new. This is where I'm going to split up the video into two different possibilities depending on what information you are willing to accept. If you think Gaara is light speed and you think that Crocodile is also light speed without accounting for Luffy's potential growth, then the outcome likely comes down to a 50-50. Crocodile just needs to touch Gaara, and Gaara just needs to seal Crocodile. Whoever pulls it off first wins, but I'd put my money on Gaara. Moving on to the second possibility, if you think Crocodile is at the very least 10 times faster than light, he should eventually be capable of making physical contact with Gaara and instantly dehydrating him. We know for a fact that Gaara's sand has a limit to how fast it can protect him. A 10 times difference in speed should be enough for Crocodile to touch him with his sand. I don't see how Gaara catches him with a Grand Sand Mausoleum, and he's less likely to use a sand armor around this point in time. Either way, Crocodile also has a poisonous hook that can melt stones, so it'll likely be helpful in dissolving the sand armor. Also, in case you haven't noticed, I haven't used the Doriki scaling for Crocodile for this latter portion since I don't think it's necessary, but if you were to apply it and lowballed the number of fights Luffy could have gotten stronger from, with Magellan being the only one, that would mean Luffy got a bare minimum of 4 times faster since Sabaody, which would by proxy make Crocodile at bare minimum 4 times faster than light, and on a highball 40 times faster than light if you go by Luffy's second gear, Interception. One last thing I should talk about is Crocodile's fights within Marineford. Listen, I am sure that one could upscale him even further since he fought Doflamingo, Mihawk, and Akainu, but with an asterisk. I think upscaling him would be entirely unquantifiable since he never actually fights them seriously. Whether or not Crocodile is going all out is irrelevant because they are not going all out. You cannot argue Doflamingo or Mihawk even remotely tried since neither of them used a named attack, and at one point Dofi even chops off Crocodile's head and he could have just killed him right there if he had just used Haki. As for Akainu, he caught him off guard. I don't know what else to tell you. Akainu suffered no damage and just put himself back together. So there you have it. I think depending on what information you're willing to use, the fight is honestly kind of close since they really only need to hit each other once in order to win. If I had to be honest, the fight can be skewed more towards Gaara's favor if you put them in a desert because he has much better feats when it comes to manipulating large quantities of sand, thereby making the Grand Sand Mausoleum an easier win condition. Yes, Crocodile sent a sand tornado across Alabasta, but Gaara could create giant sand tsunamis that even his father thought were coming from the Shukaku, and he could also stop a meteor with his sand alongside Inoki's help. It's definitely more impressive, at least to me, than sending a single sand tornado that would have finished off an already deserted town. But that's it for the video. Thank you all so much for watching. I will catch you all in the next one. Peace out.